So this just shows you a picture of the different types of microorganisms. We see in the top right corner bacteria. This is tuberculosis, or TB, so Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It's a rod-shaped cell, and it kind of shows you the size there. We'll talk about sizes of microorganisms in just a second. If you go to the right and stay on the top, the next picture is fungi. This is a filamentous fungus. So fungi generally are very filamentous, so they are thready, and this particular one has reproductive spores on the end of the branches. So that's how they reproduce. They actually make spores, and those sacs on the ends are holding the spores to be released into either water or wind or etc. to be spread to other organisms. Next we have algae. So there's several different types of algae in this picture. This is probably some pond water that's magnified 500 times. So we see different shapes of algae. We see some green algae there, so it's probably a photosynthetic algae. And we see some spirogyia, or a filament of spirogyia. And then the golden brown little critters are diatoms, and those are like little they look like little pieces of brown rice. Moving down below, starting again from the left, we see viral particles. And so this is herpes simplex virus, the cause of cold sores. So this would be herpes simplex 1. It is magnified 100,000 times. So viral particles are very, very, very small. Very difficult to see. Even microscopically, you have to have a special microscope. We don't get to look at any viral particles in this class because we don't have a microscope that can magnify to that degree. Next we have protozoa. So again, protozoa and algae both can be grouped into the kingdom Protista. And Protista is sort of a catch-all kingdom. When we don't know where else to put something, it generally goes into Protista. So this textbook sort of divides that out between algae, which is more plant-like, and protozoans, which are more animal-like. So in this picture, we see a pair of Vorticella stalked cells. And so these actually feed. They don't make their own food, which is what makes them more animal-like. And we can see the cilia up at the top, so it kind of looks like a vase. And at the top of the vase, we see some little filamentous wisp, sort of clear wispy things, and that's the cilia. And so it beats and whirls around, and it brings in even smaller cells to feed on. The last picture is a picture of the cyst, or the reproductive structures of helminths, or parasitic roundworms. So this is actually embedded in somebody's muscle tissue. You can see how the worms are coiled up. They're in a cyst or a resting state. And we'll talk more about those later. Those are interesting, definitely very, very interesting microorganisms. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the size of microorganisms. This is from page 7 of your textbook, and it shows just how sort of the range of microorganisms, what's microscopic, what's macroscopic. There is an error on this slide, so I'm going to point that out in just a second. But let's look down at the bottom first, the blue row. So the blue row, the very bottom, we're going to start small. We start with 0.1 nanometers, and that's close to the size of a hydrogen atom. So we go up a little bit and we have an amino acid, a very small molecule. When we get to 1 nanometer, we can see DNA. We can see a large protein. We can see flagellum. When we get to 10 nanometers, and we have to have an electron microscope in order to see anything in this group, in which we don't have here at Surrey, but when we get to 10 nanometers with an electron microscope, you can see viruses for the first time. So viruses have quite a big size range themselves. They go from 10 nanometers to 200 nanometers. Poliovirus is the smallest. Pox virus is the largest. So within that, we can see examples of some different viruses, hepatitis B, AIDS virus. And then right before we get out of that viral size range, we see something called Mycoplasma Bacteria. These are really primitive bacteria. They don't have a cell wall, which most bacteria do, so they're just kind of a funky blob shape. And they're really like the pre-bacteria. So we'll talk more about those later on. But when we go from 200 nanometers up to 1 micrometer, we get into the size where we can begin to see bacteria with a regular old light microscope. So the smallest bacteria are rickettsias, and then we see some rod-shaped E. coli. We can see some coccus or round-shaped staphylococcus. So most bacteria are going to fall between 1 to 10 micrometers. Once we get above 10 micrometers, then we can start to see some cells that are in our body. Red blood cells, white blood cells, and this is where we start to see some of the guys that are in the protozoan category. So we can see algae, we can see amoebas, and here's where the error occurs. We're in the orange row. When we move from orange to yellow, we leave what we have to have a light microscope to see, to where we can see these organisms with the human eye, without a microscope. So if you look to the right, it says macroscopic, macroscopic. It should be macroscopic on top, microscopic on the bottom. So 100 micrometers and less, it's microscopic. When we get close to 1 millimeter, it becomes macroscopic. So we can see things like fungi, the reproductive structures of bread mold. We can see small insects such as the louse, which is singular for lice. And so if you are a little bit confused about these metric terms, you can see an example of the metric scale at the bottom and the differences there between, kilometer, a meter, millimeter, micrometer, nanometer. So especially important in this class is to kind of have some orientation to the difference between what a millimeter is, what a micrometer is, and what a nanometer is.